Happy Sunday. I am back with another nutrition lesson straight out of a full body session. So I have no makeup on and crazy hair, just playing it real this week. Today, I'm going to be talking about common fat loss mistakes. Not going to lie, it's not my favorite topic, mostly because most of the nutrition content out there is very weight loss centric. And so people just become overly fixated on weight loss. They're chronically restricting, they're crash dieting, they're dieting too often, and it's just become problematic in its own right. So when that happens, when people are chronically restricting, it's just as, if not more harmful than the opposite side of the spectrum. So because of that, as a coach, I spend most of my time talking about the things that you should spend most of your time doing, which is eating enough consistently throughout the day and learning how to read and honor your biofeedback signals. So that's what the majority of my lessons and content is about. But today we're going to talk about fat loss because it was requested, and I think it's important to talk about it and hear it from a coach who talks about it in a balanced and approachable and sustainable way instead of from Netflix. So, disclaimer for this week, this lesson is obviously about fat loss. So I'm going to be talking about macros and a caloric deficit. My recommendation is to, you know you best. So make the decision that's right for you. You know what these topics are about. If this isn't going to be the best for you, just go ahead and swipe or pick a different lesson to watch this week under the hashtag Nutrition with Morgan. But if you're familiar with my coaching, you know that I am very cognizant in how I discuss these topics, and I try to make them as compassionate and as inclusive as possible. So that's the disclaimer. Make the choice that's right for you, and I'll clap for you because it's important. All right, so we are going to get started. I'm gonna go through this mistake by mistake, just make it really easy and clear. So if you wanna come back and kind of navigate through the lesson, you can find it easily. Mistake number 1, calculating your deficit without knowing your maintenance intake. To say this mistake is common is a total understatement. I hear and see this all the time. People get the itch to lose weight for one reason or another. They'll download an app or they'll go to an online calculator and they'll plug in their information to figure out how much they should be eating in order to achieve their weight loss goals. And then they immediately start eating those numbers. Why is this a mistake? Metabolisms are adaptive, they're not fixed. So they will increase or decrease according to the stimulus that they are exposed to, and that includes a number of factors like your activity level, your muscle mass, your caloric intake. If you weren't tracking your intake before, there's really no way to know what your metabolism looks like, what sort of shape it's in, and no way to just know the exact maintenance range that you have at the moment. Calculators, even the calculations that I do as a coach, are just an educated guess. There can be a huge margin of error. So especially if you have if you're an endurance athlete or if you're just very active at your job, if you've been chronically under eating in the past, your metabolism has adapted to that stimulus, and it can be hard for calculations to kind of take note of that adaptation. So a calculator might tell you that you can lose weight at 1,800 calories a day, but if you're currently maintaining your weight at 1,600 calories and don't know it because you haven't been tracking, you can see how that recommendation could be problematic and not do what you think it would do. You would either continue to maintain because it would be within your maintenance range, or you might slowly start to gain weight. You can hear the verbiage that I'm using. I say hypotheticals because I don't know. I don't know until we have tracked data over time. So this can be extremely frustrating if you are working really hard to track your intake and stay within a certain goal that the app or the calculator gave you, and you're not losing weight or you're gaining weight. I hear it all the time in that group. People will be like, I don't feel like the science works, or it's just not working for me. And it's not that the science doesn't work, it's that the approach isn't correct, or there's a variable that's missing. So mistake number 2, we're just gonna kind of carry that sort of thought process a little bit further. Sometimes people will jump into a too aggressive caloric deficit and do it too quickly. So sometimes they might have like an upcoming event, like a wedding is a very common one, or a vacation, and they crunch the numbers and they're like, okay, in order to lose X amount of weight in X amount of time, I need to eat an 8,000 calorie deficit. Or even worse, they'll just jump to the very arbitrary recommendations that are like 1,200 or 1,400 calories to lose weight, which could be even more of a caloric deficit, like 1,200 calories or 1,500 calories, depending on what your actual maintenance is. For one, this is extremely difficult to adhere to, even for someone who's very seasoned with dieting or who does it for a living like myself. You are going to experience very strong hunger signals, you're going to experience fatigue, you're going to experience strong psychological rebounds from the extreme restriction, which is just a fancy way of saying you're going to notice some very, very strong, hard to navigate cravings. And this is all reinforced by popular culture. Name a magazine or a celebrity, like Oprah, and they've likely described some sort of restrictive diet or approach that they've tried in order to lose weight for like a role or a tour or whatever it is. And as a result, people think that this is like the way to do it, that this is how you lose weight, and they try it and they can't stick to it because it's not sustainable or realistic. And then they beat themselves up when they can't carry it out and stick to their diet and think it's like their willpower or their discipline. So in reality, it just wasn't a good plan in the first place. And also just a friendly little reminder, celebrities, Oprah, they're not nutrition professionals, okay? They're not nutritionists, they're not dietitians, they're likely not even working with one, and if they are not good ones. So don't listen to celebrities for nutrition advice. Another reason why this is problematic, doing a too aggressive approach, is because you'll lose quite a bit of muscle mass when you do this, and muscle mass is really difficult to gain. And there's kind of like a compound impact that it has. So I'm going to describe what I mean by that. Women can gain maybe 1/4 to a pound of muscle mass a month. And that is, it could be even lower than that, it could be a little bit higher than that. It's really dependent on a multitude of factors, including your training history. On the flip side of things, you can lose like 1 pound a week sustainably for most like average adults. And you can see it's like a similar effort, but much different result. So muscle mass, losing it is going to impact performance, but it's also going to impact your body composition and your metabolism in the long run. Weight loss isn't the same as fat loss. If I could put that on a billboard, I would. Just because someone says, hey, I lost 10 pounds in 2 weeks, that is horrifying. Horrifying. It's not good in terms of body composition and many other factors. When you lose weight at that aggressive deficit, at that aggressive rate, you're losing a combination of water, you're losing food, you're losing some fat, you're also losing muscle. And this is true for any deficit, but in a more aggressive one, you're going to lose a lot more muscle. So the less muscle mass you have, the less of an athletic shape you have, that's going to look different on everyone, right? And the lower your BMR is going to be. Your BMR is your basal metabolic rate, just a fancy way of saying you're going to burn less calories overall. So this is why crash dieting is so bad for you and why people end up gaining weight on them. Their BMR decreases because of the deficit, and they can't sustain the deficit because it's too aggressive, and then they return back to their previous intake or even a little bit more than their previous intake because they're very, very hungry and restricted, and they end up gaining weight because that intake is now technically a surplus because of the metabolic adaptation that has occurred. It's hard to describe. But it is monumental because I know here in the States, This is a very, very common cycle, and people get frustrated because they're working so hard, so often on trying to diet, and it ends up being more difficult as time goes on. And this is why people say maybe diets don't work. It's not necessarily that diets don't work, it's that these diets don't work, this aggressive approach that isn't realistic or sustainable. Okay, so moving on to mistake number 3. Another very common scenario is that people will decide to lose weight and then they focus on clean eating. So I'm talking about making food choices that are more unprocessed. Maybe they're eating lots of like kale smoothies and salads and egg white omelets and chicken and broccoli, that sort of a thing. And while foods like fruits and vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, nuts and seeds, those are great, those are really important, they're nutrient dense, they're filling, they should comprise the majority of your diet. There's a few things wrong with this approach. The first one is that in order to lose weight, most folks have to be in a caloric deficit. In order to lose weight, you have to be in a caloric deficit, but in order to lose fat, most folks have to be in a caloric deficit. So you can eat all the unprocessed foods and still not be in a caloric deficit. 2, it's a form of restriction in its own right, and it can backfire, just like the aggressive deficit backfires. I mentioned psychological rebound above, which is basically just very, very strong cravings. This is what I mean by that. So when you're chronically avoiding foods that you love, your desire for them is going to build over time. And when that desire builds and your satiety is very low, your cravings are very high, it's a perfect recipe for binging. So we see this often. And life is just stressful now. The world is stressful. Current events are stressful. And so it's this like perfect storm for weight gain. In reality, nutrition as a whole, the goal should always be balance, okay? Across the board. We're talking enough fats, enough proteins, enough carbohydrates, enough calories, enough fiber, enough produce, and enough variety as well. So it wasn't my last lesson, maybe the previous lesson on different types of hunger. I talk about taste hunger, which is in the intuitive eating framework of nutrition. Taste hunger is basically like the desire for specific tastes. And if you are also ignoring taste hunger on top of psychological or physical hunger, that is going to compound over time. You want to really make sure that your body and your brain are getting what you need and what you want in moderation, and that it's balanced. And this way it's just like a whole lot more sustainable. You're gonna have to, what I mean by moderation is like I said, working in appropriate amounts of food to fuel your activity level, but also making sure that you're getting enough nutrients, but also getting enough cravings as well. It's kind of like this perfect blend. You don't want to completely avoid something because that desire is just going to build over time. Okay, so mistake number 4, not building the deficit. We were just talking about this in the previous, there was a question about this in the group where it came up. In a perfect world, we'd be able to just slice off a small amount of calories off our intake and just indefinitely lose weight and achieve our goal and be done with it. But that's not how our bodies work. So I talked about metabolic adaptation. This applies here as well. Our metabolisms are adaptive, so as we cut calories, our metabolisms adapt to that new intake. So while I might see that number on the scale decrease as I am in a 250 caloric deficit for the first few weeks, that loss might stall over time, or plateau is generally how you hear it explained. And that is because of the metabolic adaptation that has occurred. So in this case, I'd want to just increase the deficit a little bit so that I can continue to lose weight. I can do this by decreasing the amount of food that I'm eating, but I can also do this by adding in some cardio. I generally recommend adding in, it's called LISS, low intensity steady state cardio, things like walking, or even like just chill biking, because It doesn't require a ton of energy, and it doesn't spike your appetite like things like high intensity do. Again, it's very, very common to calculate deficit via an app or a calculator, and it's not actually a deficit, or it might be in range of your maintenance, because maintenance is a range, it's not a specific number, and so people will get frustrated because they can't lose weight. So in this case, depending on the amount of calories you're maintaining at, you'd either benefit from increasing the deficit. So if it told you that you would lose weight on 1,800 calories, maybe cut it to 1,650 or 1,600 calories and see if you lose weight there. But you might need to commit to a reverse diet and progressively overload your caloric intake over time so that your metabolism can positively adapt over time and maintain there for a bit, so that in the future you can cut at a more manageable level, so that you could cut at 1,800 calories. Gives you more wiggle room and makes the cut more sustainable and just easier because you're getting more food while also achieving the same goal. Okay, mistake number 4, spending too much time in a deficit. Another really, really common mistake, just spending too much time in a deficit. Either people are doing this unknowingly, they're just eating too little to maintain their activity level, or they attempt to diet too frequently. I see this a lot from people who are using apps. They'll just continually go back and press the deficit or the cut option, and it's either too aggressive or it's not the appropriate choice for them or whatever it is, and they're not successful in it, so they just continue to come back, or they don't have the habits to support the deficit. There's a ton of reasons why people don't do well in a caloric deficit, but the result is always them trying again, and the more you try again, the more deregulation that occurs. So generally speaking, a cut should only last about 6 to 16 weeks, and it's going to be dependent on your individual circumstances. For every cut, you want to spend equal amounts of time in maintenance after the fact. So if you do the math, that's like 1 to 2 cuts a year at max. And if in the past you've tried to lose weight, like for your birthday or for vacation or for summer or for a holiday, you benefit more from a reverse diet and long-term maintenance so that your metabolism and your body can regulate again, like I explained, and it'll just put you in a better position so that you can cut and have a successful cut in the future. Always play the long haul. So if you spent time in maintenance, this is another common scenario. If you spend time in maintenance, attempted a cut, built the deficit, and just haven't seen any body composition changes, that's a telltale sign your body probably isn't in a good spot to be in a caloric deficit. It's not reacting well. I suggest reverse dieting and maintaining for a longer period of time and then giving it a go ahead. That is a scenario that happens when people over restrict, or maybe there's some hormone stuff going on under the hood. Okay, mistake number 5. You don't have enough fat to lose. Don't roll your eyes at me, because this was me. This was me. I can speak for this one with personal experience. I come from a CrossFit background. I did CrossFit for like 10 years, super into it. It was like my life. Legitimately, I spent all day at the gym. I coached, you name it, I did it. And a few years back, not a few years, a lot years back, I committed to a 12-week cut. 12 weeks, appropriate amount of time, right? No, not for me, because I didn't have fat to lose. I wasn't in a good position for a cut. I had no business being in a cut. I was already pretty lean, but I wasn't happy with my body composition because I was just small. I didn't have a whole lot. I had muscle mass, but I was after like that thick, like you look at someone and you're like, damn, they lift and they look really athletic and strong. I wanted that look. And instead, I had no quads, no glutes. I was just like a washboard, like literally. And I wasn't happy with it. I would see photos or videos of me and be like, I don't look like an athlete. I look like I'm gonna snap in half. It's not that I was eating enough, but For my goals, I would have benefited more from changing the stimulus of my workouts a lot, for more strength-oriented workouts instead of more like endurance strength workouts in CrossFit, a lot of Metcons, and also progressively overloading my caloric intake over time so that I could build muscle mass. And then in the future, I would have more lean mass at a healthy level of leanness. So I would have more size when I was lean instead of being just like I said, like a washboard. So the main thing to remember here, people are always like, oh, but look at this fat on my body. Yes, you're supposed to have fat on your body, especially if you're a woman, especially if you are menstruating. I'm gonna qualify that even more. Because fat is essential for health for both men and women. For menstruating people, that's how our endocrine system operates. Specifically, like it makes it's even more important for us. So you're not going to eliminate every ounce of fat on your body, and fat makes you feel good. It can also help your body work the way that it's supposed to, and also help with your shape overall. So just like a personal anecdote, last year I did a very long mass, and I was only a few pounds under what I weighed when I was 9 months pregnant with all 3 of my children. No one would have known, and this is just a very good example of how body composition is relative and very important compared to weight, because I felt amazing. I put on a substantial amount of muscle mass and a caloric surplus, and following TWK, I looked nice and full and athletic because that muscle mass gave me shape, as did the fat, and my hormones regulated back to a healthy baseline. It was just really incredibly beneficial all around. And if I had just used that number on the scale as the single metric, I would have been devastated. I would have been like, oh my gosh, I weighed this when I was 9 months pregnant. How did I let myself go like this? No, friends. Weight isn't body composition, and body composition is relative, okay? So like, you really only want to use the number on the scale as a metric that you use with other metrics over time. A single weigh-in does not mean much. So these are just a few of the fat loss mistakes that I see. There's a ton of them, and I tried to combine a lot of the themes in this lesson into each mistake so I could cover as much as I could. I also put up a Ask Me Anything on IG and got a few questions over there, so I'm gonna take a few seconds to just run through a few of those questions. So first question was, I would like to lose 10 pounds of body fat. What is a good length for a cut? So this depends on your individual circumstances, whether or not a conservative or a more moderate deficit is appropriate for you, what your current habits are, what your experience is, what your goals are, what sport you do. There's a ton that go into this decision, but generally speaking, I would recommend about 10 to 16 weeks. And you also want to be aware that when you're done with the cut and you start reverse dieting, you're going to start adding calories in, you're going to start adding carbohydrates in, more importantly, and so that's going to kind of top off your glycogen stores finally, and you are going to start feeling better energy for sure, better satiety, but you might feel a little bit like fluffier. I hate that term, but you know what I mean, and that's really because you are gaining some water in your muscle tissue. That's how we get the glycogen in there, and so that will result in a few, like 2 to 3 tops of pounds on the scale. So don't freak out if you see that gain a little bit. It's important. Go based off of how you look, how you feel, and just take a deep breath. It's okay if you see 2 to 3 pounds gained on the scale after a cut. Number 2, how can you tell if you're actually losing fat or gaining muscle without a scale? Great question. The mirror, photos, training videos, you're gonna notice that your certain parts of your body where muscles are going to start looking fuller. You're going to be stronger, right? And so it might be your quads, your glutes, your lats, your delts, your biceps, like name a muscle. It also depends on what your focus is. If you're focusing on body recomposition, the changes are going to be a lot slower. If you're focusing on a caloric deficit, or a surplus, like it's gonna depend on your individual circumstances, but that's generally my recommendation, is look to where your muscles are. And sometimes you'll hear people say how your clothes fit. I'm not such a huge fan of that recommendation. It needs context. For example, I'm a pretty petite person, 5'6", and I have like a narrow skeleton. It's just like my build. And when I started focusing on lifting, my body grew where my muscles are. And so like I have lats. And so my bra sizes, it's like a large. Even though I'm not a large or large, I still need a large to fit in my bras. Or like with pants, I need a larger size and then I get tailored for the waist. So it depends. I wouldn't use sizing as your metric for clothing. I would use context with clothing and how you feel. Like I love how clothes fit me when they fit me well. And that's like, I just feel strong and athletic and good in my body. So that is what you want to look for. But generally speaking, you want to take pictures and just look to where your muscles are. And pair that with other metrics like how you're feeling in the gym. So number 3, I know you can't target fat loss, but what's the best way to get rid of stomach fat? I train and see gain in my muscles, but I still have a stomach. Okay, so a friendly reminder, it's totally okay to have fat on your stomach. You should. I know what you mean, but I just want to reinforce that. You are definitely on the right track if you are noticing muscle gains. And in a caloric surplus, you're going to see muscle gains along with some fat, depending on the rate of your surplus. Especially for women or menstruating people, because that's just how genetics and hormones, how it distributes our fat across the body. You'll see fat loss in a caloric deficit. So you can decrease fat in that area via a deficit, but you're also going to decrease fat overall. Just keep in mind that a healthy level of leanness, and what I mean by that is your endocrine system is operating well and there's no disruption of hormones, you will look different on different people. So a good example of that is if you look at people on like a bodybuilding stage, like bikini, if you look at bikini competitors and you're like, wow, that person has a 6-pack, and that person's very, very lean, but there's no 6-pack. Or it looks different on that person. It's because of their frame, their genetic build of their muscles, like the length and shape and stuff of their muscles. There's going to be variation from person to person, and it's going to affect how it looks at certain levels of leanness on certain individuals. So just keep that in mind. A 6-pack isn't a great goal to have because there's no way in knowing. You can build muscle up in that region by doing core work or just doing compound movements and engaging your core. You can eat in a caloric deficit and lose weight overall. You can cycle through those like I do, but it's going to look different on everyone. Number 4, how to pursue fat loss and hormone balance. So I'm going to assume you're talking about like thyroid or reproductive hormones here, and you can't. That's the answer. It's not what people want to hear. Believe me, I hear this every day. Go back and forth with people. If you have suboptimal hormone levels, like thyroid, reproductive hormones, a caloric deficit isn't going to be in your best interest. A deficit is stress on the body, so hormones like T3, which is the thyroid hormone, are going to decrease in a caloric deficit, so it's just not ideal to eat in a caloric deficit if it's already low. People who have a menstrual cycle will see a disruption in their cycle or lose it altogether if they are in a deficit too long or too frequently. consider a deficit like gasoline and a hormonal imbalance like a fire. It's just going to make it worse. So overall, you want to look at total stress levels, especially if we're talking about reproductive hormones, which is more common. And keep in mind that stress is accumulative. So it's not just nutrition. You might have to lower your training volume. And by might, I mean yes, you do. And I don't mean just intensity. It could be just the amount of time that you are moving your body. I had to lower my training intensity and volume. I had to eat in a caloric surplus for months and months and months, and I had to stay there and commit to it in order to regulate my hormones. I also had to learn different techniques to just regulate my central nervous system. I went through a very rough period of high intensity training, competitive exercise, paired with like back-to-back traumatic experiences. I had 3 kids in 4 years. I had a spouse that was deployed. It's just like a lot in a very short time period, and I was like a dumpster on fire rolling down the street. It was not good. And so eating in a caloric surplus or deficit at that time, even if I wasn't happy with my body composition, even if I felt uncomfortable, I had higher level of body fat, just wasn't going to be ideal. And I know that's not what people want to hear, but it's true. You're only going to benefit from decreasing stress and time. So I'm going to call it there, and I can do another lesson on this in the future as well. I know that there's a lot of questions on it, and I know I said it's not my favorite topic, and it really isn't, but I see the value in talking about it and just hearing it from a coach that values a comprehensive approach, balanced approach, a sustainable approach, and so I'll talk about it. So if you have any other questions, I'm more than happy to do another lesson on it. I don't want people going to Netflix and doing like watermelon fasts. That's like the new thing, I guess. That's what I heard. It just creates more deregulation and challenges and harm. So I would rather talk about the things that I don't want to talk about if it prevents that from happening. So again, if you have any questions, drop them in the comment section below. If you have any requests for topics to be covered in the future, just let me know. I'm more than happy to cover them. And I hope you all have a great week. I hope this lesson was helpful. And thank you so much for the feedback that I have gotten so far. It's always good to hear what you guys think of it and what you want to see covered, what you value. So thank you for letting me know, and I'll see you next week.